Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today, presented by myself, Ariane Turley from SimilarWeb, as well as the New York Times on coronavirus's impact on digital audiences. Just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. One, everyone is automatically muted, but if you have any questions, please feel free to type them directly into the Q&A box in Zoom, and we will be having a short Q&A session at the end once we finish presenting the data, and we can see all the questions that you're typing in as we're going. So with that, I'll just get started. So as I said, my name is Ariane Turley, and I am an industry consultant here at SimilarWeb, focusing on the publishers and media space. So what I do essentially is take all of the great data that SimilarWeb has and derive insights specifically in the publishers and media, as well as classified space. And I'm very excited today to be joined with Gordon Hurd, who is from the New York Times. So I'll let Gordon quickly introduce himself, and then we'll get started.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. My name is Gordon Hurd, and I'm an editor at the New York Times. I work primarily on SEO, and as this was obviously a big search story, SimilarWeb asked me to come along and kind of chime in on what we've done. I've been at the Times since July of 2018, and I'm having a great time there. Thanks.
Great, thanks Gordon. So with that, we'll just get started. So the agenda for today is we'll be covering sort of 6 main topics. First, I'll do a quick introduction into SimilarWeb and the data that we have. And then I'll dive right into it. And so first we'll talk a little bit about sort of the news and media traffic shifts that we've seen. From there, I'll hand it over to Gordon, who will sort of dive deeply into exploring how the New York Times specifically has covered the coronavirus pandemic. And then we'll look specifically at a couple of other areas besides sort of coronavirus news that has gained traction. So from cooking and recipe content, we'll also look a little bit at sports coverage, and then we'll just end on a note on thinking about what's next for the category. So a little bit of an introduction. So for those of you who may not be familiar with SimilarWeb or what we do, one of the things that we're really trying to do is keep everyone as up to date on the coronavirus as possible. And so what we've done is we've actually developed a coronavirus mini site. So the URL is here. Just go to similarweb.com/coronavirus. And if you go to this website, you'll be able to, there's a really great insights hub where you can keep track of the latest coronavirus related traffic trends, engagement trends across many different industries, from financial services to e-commerce to retail, across many different geographies. So not just the US, but also the UK, Germany, France, etc. On this sort of coronavirus mini site, you'll also be able to sign up for our email digest. And what that means is that you'll get tailored emails once or twice a week, directly relevant to your industry, and it'll go straight to your inbox with just sort of our top insights for the week. And finally, we'd really encourage you to all follow us on social media. We're very active on LinkedIn. I myself post on LinkedIn. Please follow us on Facebook and Twitter as well. We're constantly posting coronavirus and COVID related coverage on all of these different social media platforms. And for those of you who aren't familiar, I do just want to go through SimilarWeb's methodology quickly. And this is sort of really informs a lot of the data that you'll see throughout the presentation. So the first part of SimilarWeb's methodology is our data collection piece. And so the way we collect data is that we have hundreds of diverse data sources that collects anonymous behavioral data throughout the web. And we're looking not only at desktop, but also mobile web, as well as mobile app data, so iOS and Android. And I think a second part of our data methodology, and I think this is really our bread and butter and what makes SimilarWeb unique, is our data processing capabilities. And so what that means is that we get a series of a ton of direct measurement data. So a lot of websites partner with us to directly give us their Google Analytics, Adobe Analytics data, and we calibrate that direct measurement data with our own collected data to create predictive models. And so what that means is that we're able to really show traffic trends and engagement data for basically every website on the internet. And the third piece of sort of our methodology is our market intelligence solution. And so you're able to access this data directly through our platform and we serve a wide variety of industries, from investors to salespeople to sort of brands, publishers and media as well, through our 5 different solutions: marketing intelligence, audience intelligence, purchase intelligence, investment intelligence, and finally, sales intelligence. And what really makes SimilarWeb unique is sort of these 4 key points. I think the first thing that we like to talk about is our global coverage. So we're looking at websites around the world. And so for any given website, not only can you see it at sort of the worldwide level, so see, for the New York Times, for example, see traffic that's coming from the US, the France, sort of a worldwide level, but also at a local level as well. And so you can see, how is your website doing in Germany versus France? What keywords are driving traffic to these various websites based on location? The second piece that really makes our data unique is that it exists across all platforms. So you have data that you can see across desktop, mobile web, and mobile apps, iOS and Android. And I think the third piece to this is sort of the actionable granularity that our data offers. And so for each website, not only can you see traffic and engagement data, you can also see very granular data such as on-site search performance. What are people searching directly on your site? Performance metrics, so engagement, bounce rates, how long people are spending on your site, conversion funnels as well. So thinking about, what products are converting. And then finally, the last piece of this is your speed to insight. And so what that means is that you can go directly onto our platform to access this data for yourself. And our data is updated every day. And so, you can go look at the last 28 days of data, looking at what's happened in the last 28 days, and take that insight directly to back to your company, to your brand, and show the insights that you've derived directly from our platform. So sort of with that, I just wanted to dive a little bit into what exactly we'll be covering for the rest of this presentation. And if you remember back to sort of the agenda for today, you'll see that we're really looking at 4 main topics. And I think the first thing that we've seen is that the coronavirus outbreak has led to a 36% increase in traffic and readership across news and media outlets. This is huge, and we see that across the web, especially in the news and media space, readership was at an all-time high in March 2020. And within these sort of news and media outlets specifically, we've seen that the New York Times has actually seen some of the largest growth in traffic due to their swift and comprehensive coverage of the outbreak. They grew at 71% in March 2020. And Gordon will sort of talk more specifically about what that means and how they really covered that. And really beyond coronavirus news, we also wanted to look at what people were consuming while they were stuck at home. And one of the things that we found is that cooking and recipe content had flourished in particular, and particularly the art of making bread. And so we'll look into that specifically, of how people and publishers were able to capitalize on the popularity of cooking and recipe content, and also what publishers were winning in this space. And the fourth point, the fourth topic that we really want to talk about is sports coverage. And so I think a lot of sports media outlets were really struggling because sports have been put on hold worldwide. And what we found is that a lot of sports media outlets have started to find new and creative ways to continue to drive readership across the industry. So with that, we'll start off and just dive deeply into sort of news and media traffic shifts across the landscape in the United States. So this is just looking at monthly traffic to all news and media sites in the US from 2017 to 2020. And what you see is that from 2017 through 2019, there was sort of a steady decline in traffic to news and media sites. In both 2018 and 2019, we saw that overall traffic to news and media sites declined slightly at 5% year over year. And when you looked at January and February 2020, you saw that the story wasn't getting that much better. And in January and February 2020, sort of in the light blue, you see that traffic was actually a lot lower than it had been in 2017, 2018, and even 2019. But after the coronavirus started to become a global pandemic, you saw that this led to a huge, unprecedented level of traffic increase in March 2020. And so you see between March and February 2020, traffic to news and media sites worldwide increased over almost 40%, which is just unprecedented levels of traffic increases. And what's interesting about this too is that the traffic increase has really been sustained, and we really haven't seen significant traffic drops in April. And if we look specifically at the month of March, we can really isolate when this traffic started to increase. And so this is looking at daily traffic to news and media sites across desktop and mobile in the US, looking at March through April 2019 versus the same time period in 2020. And what you see is that traffic really started to increase sort of the second week of March, so March 9th, March 10th of 2020. And this is unsurprising because this is when we saw many states start to issue states of emergencies and also start to declare stay-at-home orders. And so you can really see that this has been sustained through the last 6 weeks as people are really struggling to figure out, what's going on, how do they stay informed, and they're turning to these news and media sites to do this. So we'll just start off with a quick poll, and this is just a way to sort of keep the webinar interactive. And we want you guys to know, which of the major news sources do you think experienced the most dramatic traffic gains in light of COVID 2019? So you'll see the poll pop up on your screen. If you could just sort of do a quick poll, that would be great. And we'll share the answers when we're done. So we can see the results that 42% of people think that Google saw the most dramatic traffic gains in light of COVID 2019. Well, if you look at the next slide, you'll see that actually 42% of you guys were wrong. And what we see is that between January and April 2020, the New York Times has actually seen the largest increase in share of traffic in terms of sort of overall traffic. And I think what's interesting about this too is sort of, one, you'll see that CNN has sort of always maintained the #1 most visited news website in the United States. They sort of are always at the top of the line, but they've only grown 47% in March 2020 versus January 2020. And if you look at the New York Times, in January, you start to see that their traffic is pretty close to Google's. Maybe Google's is a little bit higher sometimes, the New York Times is a little bit higher sometimes, but starting in February and really taking off in March, you see that the New York Times has started to see dramatic gains in their readership, really outpacing not only Google, but also the Washington Post. And the New York Times has grown the fastest at 71% year over year, or not year over year, sorry, month over month. And so I think what we really want to spend the rest of this time trying to understand is, what exactly did the New York Times do to make sure that they're staying on top of this coronavirus coverage? And so with that, I'll hand it over to, before we go into that, I just also did want to show how, the New York Times was really starting to cover coronavirus early. And so this is looking at sort of segments and traffic engagement. So this is looking at CNN, the New York Times, as well as the Washington Post, looking at sort of for coronavirus related pages, how many visits they're getting, as well as the sort of total page engagement, the pages per visit, et cetera. And what you see is that all of these news outlets started to cover the coronavirus in January of 2020. And they were all sort of seeing similar levels of traffic. But in February of 2020, both the New York Times and CNN really doubled down on their engagement. And then in March of 2020, you see that they actually really start to take off. And so sort of really covering them in these early periods starting in January really led to gains later in the year, sort of in March and through April. And so again, as I was saying earlier, I think what we really want to do is sort of understand what specifically the New York Times did to capitalize on this coronavirus coverage. So with that, I'll sort of hand it over to Gordon, who will sort of go specifically into exploring how the Times covered coronavirus during this time. So thanks.
Sure, yeah. So I think before I kind of get into the details, it's probably worth underlining what Ariane was saying earlier about this being really unprecedented, for the industry, but also just, the story itself, the pandemic. We haven't seen something like this in like, what, 100 years. So, the results of that as far as the news consumption and what happened online is we're definitely seeing things at a sort of unprecedented level. Go to the next slide. Yeah, so I thought it might be worth just kind of looking at a timeline really quickly, just to kind of get a sense of, sort of how did things unfold. We weren't, the Times was definitely not the first to cover the story. You can look at outlets like Reuters and the South China Morning Post, Live Science, similar sites, kind of hitting it very, very end of December, early January. We published our story, first story on the 6th, and at that point it was, a mysterious unnamed illness. We people didn't really know exactly what was going on. You can go to the next slide. And I think it's also worth noting, even though maybe traffic might have been down, 2020 actually started out pretty hot in terms of news. We had things like the Iran-US conflict. We had the killing of Soleimani. We're in the midst of debates and primaries. We had that little thing called the Trump impeachment going on. So there was lots of stuff happening that, really could be competing with what was, basically, like I said, an unnamed illness in China. But I think from the Times perspective, what we had going for us was reporters on the ground in Asia. We also, through the science desk in New York, where we had lots of reporters with medical backgrounds, our alerts were pretty high on this mysterious unnamed illness. We knew something pretty big was going to be happening. And as it unfolded over the weeks, we realized that the story was going to be really coming out on a daily basis. Next slide. So one of the things we turned to in a pretty big way, starting in January, mid-January, was live coverage. We started to, on January 23rd, we began basically what we look at as sort of 24/7 live coverage of the story, particularly through our live briefing format. And when we started in January 23rd, we haven't stopped since. So it's been over 100 days of doing this, which is basically our longest continuous run of live coverage for us ever. It's pretty, like I said, pretty unprecedented. Just looking at my notes here, sorry. Yeah, so we haven't stopped doing that since. We basically, starting in New York and going into our Hong Kong folks, and then in London, we basically go around the globe supporting an international live briefing. We have a US live briefing. We also do a live briefing for the business side of things. And obviously this live coverage is not to the detriment of other stuff. We've got a dedicated, basically a dedicated newsroom-wide collaboration going on in this. And during the early weeks of this, we actually pulled editors and reporters off of their normal duties to kind of help focus on this. We had, a single editor sort of looking at this live coverage really on a day-to-day basis. You can go to the next slide. So another thing that we focused on really strongly at this time was service journalism. Again, sort of from a newsroom-wide perspective, all hands on deck. We really focused in on trying to figure out what are the pieces of content, what are the pieces of information, what are the stories that people are really going to be looking for, in order to stay healthy, to stay safe, to stay informed, particularly as we went into March and everybody started becoming stuck at home. So in light of this, we launched certain pieces such as sewing a fabric face mask. We did an FAQ on the stimulus checks, and really, we doubled down. We really went heavy on tracking the cases of the coronavirus from a geographic perspective, also doing things like explainers. In March alone, we published over 300 pieces of journalism like this, which again was pretty unprecedented for us. Next slide. Another area of focus for us during this time was UGC. We had a huge growth in readership and engagement, so we then turned to those engaged readers for their input on what was going on in their communities, in their industries. And really we did this from, again, across the whole newsroom, which isn't a typical thing for us at the Times. And obviously the topics and the types of what we call reader callouts varied pretty widely. So as an example here, we have, we did a call out to people who were healthcare workers in the New York area, and that led to some really significant stories that we broke in the New York area on, the overtaxed 911 system. We had one of our most viewed videos during this time was a look into the Elmhurst Hospital in New York. That came from a reader tip as well. We did a roundup of videos of, sort of personal testimonies from people who are, really being affected by the coronavirus pandemic. During this time, we actually saw an unusual number of these stories actually reaching page one. And overall, we did over 30 of these call outs in March with over 100,000 submissions. So that's pretty significant effort there. Next slide. So we focused on the live coverage, we focused on service journalism, we focused on UGC, all sort of things out of the normal daily news pocket for us. And then obviously, as you saw from the numbers, that sort of paid off with huge numbers of readership. But the coverage did evolve quite a bit, actually. So we saw a lot of this engagement and growth in March, but then we started to see demand slowing a little bit, softening in April. So you can look at things in, like search demand softened a bit, but we didn't see that necessarily reflect in return readership. So, we still needed to focus in on everything we were doing. What we ended up kind of seeing happening from March through April was the channel mix kind of evolved. One of the really significant things that happened that we noticed was, Google started taking over more of its own real estate for data and results, pushing news further and further down. Search was obviously a very crucial platform for us during this time. So, obviously we didn't stop, but we had to sort of think about what else can we do to balance out that change in the algorithm and then results. So one of the things we did on that end was we leaned more into social. We noticed, in the period before the outbreak and before, became the biggest news story for a long time, with people were kind of moving away a bit from their social platforms. But what we ended up seeing through our own sort of results was that people started to readopt on those platforms. As they're stuck at home, they wanted to stay in touch with the news, but also stay in touch with their networks. So we did a lot more on social on that end. Next slide. And so how are we competing now? I think Ariane was gonna talk a little bit about this data here.
Yeah. And so I think there's a couple of things I wanted to note here. So what we're looking at, and this is really a way to sort of mirror SimilarWeb data with what they're seeing internally at the New York Times. And so this is looking at organic search traffic share for keywords related to coronavirus map. And so, things like map of coronavirus or coronavirus map in various languages worldwide. And this is looking at the traffic share that was controlled by the New York CNN in red, Washington Post in sort of a light blue, Google News in orange, and then the New York Times in dark blue. Worldwide data, so not just looking at the US, from January through April 2020. And I think what you can see is sort of because of a lot of the things that Gordon was talking about, sort of their live coverage, publishing maps of coronavirus cases, the New York Times was really able to capture a significant share of searches, traffic related to searches and coronavirus maps in February and March 2020, really beating out CNN and Washington Post. And I think what's interesting about this is that they really had sort of a global reach, right? So you see this traffic coming not only from the US, but also from people sort of worldwide. But what's also interesting is when you start to look at April, you see that some of the challenges that Gordon spoke about started to show up in terms of in our own data, right? And so Google News wasn't a player in terms of coronavirus map in January through March, they weren't showing up anywhere. But in April, they started to launch their own sort of resources that took up a large share of real estate. So in the previous screenshot, that was a search for coronavirus cases. If you search for coronavirus map, coronavirus, sort of the same thing appears. And you can see that they actually started to publish their own map of coronavirus cases as well. And so in April 2020, what we saw is that Google News started to capture about 3% of that real estate as well. And so we're thinking about how do outlets, not only the New York Times, but sort of all publishers and media shift their strategy to compete with players like Google News and not sort of their traditional competitors. But again, sort of also speaking to how what all of these things Gordon was speaking about earlier really paid off.
Yeah, I think I would just add to this, to that data, that sort of shows, it wasn't, not just coronavirus maps, coronavirus cases, it was even coronavirus symptoms. Really, almost every top line sort of search for coronavirus, Google had some sort of way to respond to that in Google results. So we really just, we needed to, stay the course, obviously, but we had to look at other ways to kind of get out the information and make sure that our reach was not going to adversely affected. And a couple of the things we noticed that was, as the story became more global, we started to basically compete, across every region, state, and country as it related to coronavirus. Whereas, earlier in this story cycle, we were sort of there all for it all. So, a couple of things we did just to just continue and stay the course, obviously, were we started early on tracking data in terms of cases. So we opened that data up. We've actually, we might be partnering with a few people to have that feed into their own content. And then, obviously, along with other major media outlets, we opened up our paywall early on. It's just a way to make sure that all that crucial virus coverage was available to people, even if they weren't subscribers. Next slide.
Yeah, and I think that was sort of really interesting. Thanks, Gordon. And I think, we sort of want to pivot away from that and, open it up again to another poll. But, besides sort of coronavirus news, coronavirus cases, symptoms, all those sorts of things related to that, we wanted to sort of think about where do you think the American public is spending their time online outside of these sources? So not travel and retail omitted, but sort of, local news and publisher sites. So if you guys want to just sort of answer the poll. Great. So it seems like most people think that local news has seen sort of the largest share of increase, and then food is sort of what 33% of people see. And I think you guys are sort of all on the right track. Sort of unsurprisingly, we see that actually local news saw the largest increase in terms of sort of monthly traffic in March 2020 versus February 2020. So local news grew at a rate of about 80% month on month, which is just crazy. Business news also saw a huge increase, which is sort of unsurprising. I know the stock market has been extremely volatile and people are really interested in things like oil prices. So that's also seen really large growth. But I think people are also on the right track of seeing that food has grown a lot as well. So even though food and recipe related sites generally have lower traffic than sort of some of these other categories, they've also seen growth at 21%. One of the few categories, or sort of two of the categories that we've seen have seen decline in traffic are one, sports. And so this again is sort of unsurprising given the fact that sports have basically been put on indefinite hold worldwide. The NBA was canceled, baseball season was postponed. And so because of that, sports publishers have been really have been struggling to continue to gain the same amount of traffic that they might have otherwise had. And then real estate sites have also sort of stagnated, and they've declined sort of at 2% year over year. But I think for now we want to first focus on food, and then we'll talk about sports a little bit later in the presentation. And I think that sort of also, segues nicely into what Gordon was saying too, because I think we wanted to show for the New York Times especially, what categories have they seen grow as well. And I'll let Gordon sort of speak to this slide quickly.
Sure, yeah. So, coronavirus was and is the dominant storyline. I mean, I said it's demand has softened a bit, but it's still the biggest story. Google itself said it's one of the biggest searches of all time. So it's not necessarily that things are growing despite coronavirus. It's sort of they're growing in conjunction. So we, for us, it was kind of a matter of pinpointing how that story touched our other areas of coverage. We did things like launching sections. We created an at-home section, to sort of aggregate all the stuff that we were putting out to touch on, the fact that not all of us are stuck at home. We launched a dedicated obits section that saw a lot of growth and a lot of engagement as well. And then as we were talking about the food and cooking sections, which were already fairly strong sections on, they saw phenomenal growth in this time frame. And I just to reiterate what we talked about with sports, the one area at the times where we didn't see the same performance growth.
Great. Thanks. So I'll just sort of take it over and dive specifically into cooking and recipe content. And so what we've seen, and this is sort of in line with that, but this is looking at sort of all traffic to cooking and recipe related sites from March 2020 through April 2020. And what we've seen is that traffic has grown 34%, which again is sort of really unprecedented. But as people are sort of stuck at home and cooking a lot more, people are exploring a lot of new recipes and ways and new things to cook. And I think, what's interesting, there's sort of two things that I want to point out here. So first is looking at what sites are winning in the cooking and recipe landscape. So this is looking at sort of a series of top keywords that are cooking and recipe related. And what you see is that the top 3 sites capturing traffic from January through March 2020 is one, All Recipes captures the largest share of search traffic, followed by the Food Network. And then finally, the New York Times, which is sort of the only food specific related publisher, is the 3rd largest site in terms of capturing share of traffic for food and recipe related searches. What's also interesting about this chart is that you see that, from January through the first week of March, growth and sort of daily traffic trends looks pretty similar. You see slight peaks during the weekend when people are cooking more, and then, lower searches during the week. But during the sort of the second week of March, when we started to see increase in traffic to sort of news sites in general, you see overall increase in searches. And so sort of from March 9th onwards, traffic and searches related to food and cooking has really just grown astronomically. And then what I wanted to also look at is sort of what specifically are people searching for. And so this is looking at the top keywords driving organic traffic in the US in March 2020 specifically. And then you can look at the how much they've grown sort of from the previous month. And so the top 3 recipes we saw, number 1 was banana bread recipe, which grew at a rate of about 170%. Instant pot recipes are things that sort of people are always searching for. And that's actually one of the few keywords that we actually saw declining. But I think one of the most interesting things that we saw is sort of this huge growth in people searching for a sourdough starter. And I don't know about you, but something that I've really noticed during this quarantine time is 1, everyone on my Instagram feed seems to be baking bread, and 2, yeast is virtually impossible to find. Every week I put yeast on my grocery list, and every week I go to the grocery store and I can't find it anywhere. And so I think as consumers were faced with a yeast shortage, we really saw searches for a sourdough starter or a way to make your own bread really took off in popularity. And actually these searches were up whopping 567% in March 2020 versus February in 2020. And what we want to see is, who is capturing the largest share of traffic for this keyword. So, when people are searching for a sourdough starter, where are they being led to? And I think what's really interesting about this is the number 1 website that's capturing share of traffic for sourdough starter is actually a flour brand. So kingarthurflour.com. It's not a recipe site. It's the actual brand itself. And King Arthur Flour has really done a lot in sort of these trying times. One is that they've really killed it in terms of search. So when you search for sourdough starter, how to make bread, they're really capturing a lot of that organic traffic share. They've published a lot of articles on things like sourdough starter. So how do you create your own sourdough starter? And what we've seen is that not only do they have these instructions, but the content will link directly to their product pages for purchasing. And because of this, and sort of the worldwide shortage of flour, we've seen that King Arthur flour sales have risen more than 2,000% in March. But that being said, we still do see that sort of these recipe-related content websites like All Recipes, The Kitchen, Bon Appetit, and also the New York Times are still, gaining traffic due to these search terms. And I think, I just wanted to sort of point to the New York Times specifically and show that the New York Times cooking has also benefited from the rise in popularity of bread. And so, as Gordon was saying, sort of food and cooking, they've seen a lot of increase in traffic. But if you look at sort of bread-related recipes specifically, this is looking at, again, sort of visits to bread-related recipe pages in the New York Times between January and March 2020. And what you see is that in March 2020 versus the previous month, visits to these bread-related pages were up 160%. So this is something that sort of is worldwide and affects, news coverage or sort of big newspapers as well, such as the New York Times. And so the last thing we wanted to talk about before we sort of go into question and answers is sports and sort of what sports media sites are doing during these times. And so if you remember back to the chart that we looked at previously, and sort of what Gordon was saying is that sports are one of the few areas where publishers have seen declines in readership. And if you look at sort of traffic to sports-related websites, so ESPN, NBC Sports, etc., this is looking at daily traffic from February through April 2020. You see that in April 2020, after sort of sports suspended their seasons indefinitely, traffic has declined 27%. I will note though, at the last week of April, we did see a huge spike in traffic due to the NFL draft. So the good news is that when things happen, such as the NFL draft, your readers are still there. And I think actually probably the NFL draft caused even more readership this year than it has in the past, because people have been so starved for sports related content. But I think, something that sports publishers are thinking about is sort of how do they make up for this lack in traffic, and how do they, still continue to drive readership. And I think I just wanted to call out ESPN specifically, and I think this is a really interesting example of what they've done to sort of combat the coronavirus. And so I'm not sure how many of you guys have been watching this show, but ESPN has been, working on this Michael Jordan documentary series for a long time, and it was originally slated to be released in June, but because of the coronavirus and all sports being canceled, they actually moved up the release date by 2 months, and had the series was and it was actually released at the end of April versus June when it was originally scheduled to be released. And what you see is that when this aired, it caused an increase in traffic to ESPN's website in sort of the second or third or fourth week of April. But what's also interesting is that it's actually driving a lot of the organic searches. So searches for The Last Dance, it was the second most searched keyword that was driving traffic to ESPN's website, second only to their brand term. So again, there are still ways to sort of capitalize on and generate interest around things that aren't necessarily, live sports. And I think what's interesting too is that other sports sites, including CBS Sports, NBC Sports, Yahoo Sports, etc., have really managed to capitalize on the interest generated from The Last Dance as well. So this is looking at traffic share for The Last Dance related keywords in April of 2020. And you can see a huge spike in searches every week when The Last Dance airs on TV. And not only has ESPN been able to gain a lot of the traffic, but other sites like CBS, NBC, Bleacher Report, etc., have gained traffic due to this. And so, they're also covering it, even if they weren't necessarily the ones who are the ones who are airing the show. So with that, I just want to spend a little bit of time just sort of thinking about what's next. And so we talked a lot about how coronavirus has led to a huge increase in traffic for news and publisher related websites, what this has meant for cooking and recipe content related websites, what this meant for sports related websites. But we really want to also think about sort of what does the next month, 2 months look like. And I think one of the big questions on a lot of people's minds right now is, are we reaching coronavirus fatigue? And what we've seen is that sort of, searches for coronavirus really reached an all-time high in sort of March. And this is looking at sort of average search trends for this keyword coronavirus from February through April 2020. And we saw a huge increase in March, and people were still searching sort of towards the end of March, beginning of April. But slowly these searches and interest in the topic has really started to decline as people sort of, aren't, it's sort of become the new normal. And I think something that we want to think about, and I'll hand it back to Gordon to show what the New York Times has been doing, is just how do publishers and media deal with this new normal? Sort of what are other things that you should be covering besides the coronavirus as well? Definitely thinking about sort of what this means for the future. So with that, I'll sort of hand it over back to Gordon to talk briefly about how one publisher, the New York Times, has approached these questions.
Yeah, so I guess I would say too, getting into some of what you see here on the slide, that we definitely have seen interest and traffic sort of soften from coronavirus, but it's not going away anytime soon. And I think even just looking at some of the stories I'm seeing bubbling up this week, there's going to be new developments. There's this story that was sort of popping out today about a spate of children who are experiencing similar symptoms when they have COVID. So I think, as this understanding of coronavirus itself develops, we're going to be seeing a lot more different stories. It might not be to the scale we saw it in March, but it's not going away anytime soon. But as far as, thinking about other things, about what's next, one of the things that we did start to notice, particularly end of March, beginning of April, that demand seemed like it was increasing for covers that might seem counterintuitive, like, it's not even necessarily on this huge pandemic we're going through. I think we started to see signs of this fatigue we were talking about. So some of the things we did, we launched a true crime section that we didn't have on the site up until then. It felt like it was a good time to sort of unleash something like that. We launched it with a story on a tiger in Harlem back in the early 2000s, sort of dovetailing with the interest in Tiger King. We released stories on UFO videos from the Pentagon that popped up last week. You might have seen this story in the murder hornets, so you get the idea. Basically, it's the things that are sort of viral and trendy that were, big stories back then. They're kind of coming back into the exposure of the public, and people are clicking through them. Some of these stories got millions of page views. As I said, obviously we're still focused on the next stages of the pandemic. It's not going to end anytime soon, but one of the kind of themes we're thinking about is just giving people a break, finding great stories that we know will give them a break.
Yeah, and I think that's great. I mean, I personally have read a lot of these stories, and it's always nice to think about sort of, take my mind off things, if even just for a little bit. So with that, we'll conclude our webinar and take this time to sort of answer some questions. Just a note here, again, you can type your questions directly into the Q&A box. If your question is not answered live, we will do our best to follow up via email. We can sort of see who asked the questions. We can see who asked the question, so we can follow up via email. And the other thing I did want to note is that we will be publishing a copy of this deck as well, and as well as a recording, so that will be accessible for everyone. So let me just look at some of the questions that have come in. One of the questions that we have here, and I think I'll let Gordon take this, is how did you make the decision on which service content items to focus on?
So that's a good question. I think, a lot of the decision making wasn't so different in other times. You try to take a sense of like what is important based on news judgment, based on, what your resources are, what kind of original sources you have, your reporting. And, we matched that up with what we were clearly seeing in terms of user demand. I think it was a real combination of, expertise and what we had available to us, in terms of resources, and then finding out, through tools like Google Trends, for example, what are people looking for? What do people want? And we really just, focused heavily on that.
Definitely. I think that's really interesting. I think something else that, another question that we have is, what are the challenges of covering such a, fast moving target, something that's changing every day with all of these different data sources?
I mean, again, I don't think it's actually all that different from the normal news cycle. It just sort of ramps up in importance. I think one of the things that we at the Times did to a greater degree, I think, than we normally do was really pool our resources. So, like I mentioned before, one of the things that happened with the rise of this storyline was we pulled people from their kind of normal duties and had them focusing on this coronavirus coverage, regardless of geography, regardless of time frame, or from coming from a science or health perspective or business or what have you. We really just pooled all of our resources, and we kind of focused in, like I said, on that daily live coverage. I think I saw there was also a question here about just trying to scroll up about the live coverage. How many people maintain the live news function, and does it drive more traffic than normal articles? I wanted to touch on that a little bit because I think people are probably really curious about that. The live news function, sort of it's a bit different, obviously, than CNN's live, where they have broadcast TV. So what it is for us is really maintaining sort of a live blog format where we can update quickly and keep people apprised of latest developments, but also sort of do curated sections that go into a little bit more detail about things and then link off to maybe our more in-depth coverage of that topic. So in the case of the coronavirus, what really changed for us was we had, like I said, all hands on deck on that effort, where we were producing a sort of, at first it was basically a single live updates story that started at like midnight and went all the way until 11:59, and then we launched a new article at the crack of 12:01. So it was really, that's what I meant by that 24/7 live coverage. And it took a lot of people, but basically it took at least one person to be focused on it at through a normal day's shift in terms of editing and focusing on how it's produced. Hopefully that answers that question.
No, I think it definitely does. I think one of the other questions I have here, and I think I can answer this one, is, do you think themes like wellness and fitness could also become more and more relevant? And I think that's definitely something that we've seen has taken off as well. Visits to wellness related sites. I know the New York Times, that's also definitely part of your service journalism piece. At least I guess that's my anecdotal experience. Maybe Gordon could corroborate that. But one of the things that I was also looking at besides, wellness and fitness in the publisher space, I was looking at some of the Amazon search data that we have, and I saw that searches for things like yoga mats, kettlebells, have really taken off on Amazon as well. And so I think this is definitely something that people are definitely paying more attention to during these times.
I think one thing just to add to that too, that sort of the areas of content outside of news, I think across the board, everything is going to be affected by this for a pretty significant amount of time. I think, insofar as the pandemic and the lockdown sort of have changed the way we work, they've changed the way we deal with wellness and fitness. Those are going to be affected fairly long term, I would say. I mean, that's just, sort of a judgment call on my part as, an editor and writer and all this other stuff, just looking at how the traffic patterns go kind of proves that out. I think that how people deal and interact with all of these other topics, including entertainment, including things like gaming and things like that, I think they're going to be affected by the coronavirus for some time to come. So it's probably worth really rethinking how you cover all those topics, not just news.
Yeah, no, I think you're definitely right. And that was something else that I wanted to touch upon on the sports coverage. I didn't include it here, but I think sports is also going to change a lot too. And one of the ways that we've seen this change is this rising popularity in things like esports, right? And I think that's something that probably won't go away after the coronavirus, and people, once they sort of explore it during this time, might have a renewed interest in something like esports, just as the sort of an example. I think we probably have time for one or two more questions. One of the things that, one of the questions we have here is, like, we saw that traffic related to coronavirus is plateauing. Do you think it'll decrease? And I think
I'm thinking.
no worries.
Honestly, I mean, I don't have, necessarily. I mean, we have some data to speak to this, and that we've seen, that dip from March. But I do think that, again, I think that we'll see things cycle. We've still got to deal with economies and states and regions opening back up. We've still got to deal with, vaccines. We still got to deal with change in season. So I do think that just seeing how things unfolded from, say December to April, that's only 4 months. This thing could be in the news consciousness for years to come. So it's tough to say if traffic will ever go back up again, but I'm sure it's going to stay at a certain significant level. I don't see it going away.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I mean, we'll be interested to see sort of what this looks like in 3 months, 6 months, and definitely we'll check in, I guess, as it goes on. So I think that's all we have for today. I don't know if there's any other questions that you wanted to answer.
I guess someone did ask about changes in approach to search, and I can speak to that just as that's something that I work closely on. And I think it's probably worth just discussing really quickly. We did see definitely changes in not only how people search for coronavirus related stories, but how Google itself sort of was treating stories and topics related to this. One of the things that we did notice was that there was a clear change. Google was surfacing regional content. I think, sometime in March, around the time that things were peaking, we started to see a difference in how, some of the major news sites like CNN, ourselves, Washington Post were showing up for more regional coronavirus searches. So there was a certain catching up, I think, that had to happen from the algorithm perspective that Google had to do to make sure that the right kind of content was surfacing for the right people searching from specific places. So I think we'll start to see that happen, with other sort of facets of coronavirus. So from a search perspective, yes, their coverage did change, and I think it's going to continue to change. We can't sort of figure that we'll be able to, come up with a formula and lock in and forget about it. We're going to have to constantly sort of keep a watch of how the story develops, but also how people search for the story too.
Great. And I think that's also, something that we have seen too in our own data, sort of related to sort of Google search. I mean, I showed the thing about Google News taking share from coronavirus maps, but when we look at referral traffic of what's driving traffic to the New York Times, I know that Google search was something that had increased in March 2020 versus February 2020, and so something that we're also constantly paying attention to as well on our side. So yeah, I think that's all we have for today. Thank you guys so much for joining. Thank you, Gordon, again for all of your time. And I hope this was an informative session for everyone. And please be sure to check out our coronavirus mini site, and we will follow up with everyone via email. So thank you guys all so much. Have a good one.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.